Location codification was certainly the word of the day, DJ. Did you guys make any headway? Do we solve any of those problems?
Oh yeah, it's all figured out. It's all figured out. But the word of the day credit goes to Mr. Mark Goldman for coining that phrase when we were at the conference in February. So it's really kind of stuck. We pretty much came into an agreement when we talked about locations and about the need to no longer have locations be linear in nature, but more of like a multi-relational type of things, like basically creating a Rosetta Stone when it came to locations and kind of further defining what the word location means to different users and different people that are involved with the project, whether it's drawings, floors, levels, areas, pour sequences, work breakdown structure, work packaging, survey coordinates, project internal coordinates, site layout, Northing and Hastings, GIS, like all this stuff is there, and trying to help kind of bring it together. And I feel like this has grown from something that we had a hard time grasping in Denver to where I think, you know, it's actually, I think, might have some legs to it. I think the team, we spent kind of a good amount of time of just trying to figure out what it means when you talk about the word location. And I think all of us in our experience, whichever side of the table that you're on, locations always seem to mean something to someone else, right? It's basically a different language for them. They may not want to see the project in a work breakdown structure. They may want to see it in some sort of pour sequence, cost codes, you know, some of those other things. So we started, I think the thing is all of us kind of had to decouple ourselves from what we currently think of as locations and kind of expand upon those things there, and started thinking of locations like, you know, when talking with like Rachel there, in essence, drawings can be considered locations, if you will, when it comes to kind of project data and some things along those lines there. So we talk about like where all of these kind of inputs, outputs, where they kind of came from. And so we, for our example, we kind of chose a specific RFI and kind of what that workflow would kind of be. And then how do we basically map some of that additional critical location information to help, you know, the design team respond to the RFI for project stakeholders, specifically, you know, the GCs or the trade partners who are doing the work, to know if this RFI potentially impacts them and how they can, you know, be a little bit more informed about changes like that, so they could potentially capture it, address it, you know, capture it within the pricing, things like that, to kind of know some of those things. So that was kind of the big thing there once we started kind of talking about locations. And Mr. Goldman came up with this location codification, and we kind of made this general assumption because we didn't want to dive into it kind of too much, but we did realize that a lot of the location information starts with the design team, right? So picking on Rachel because she was the kind of the design team representative. I don't want to be the whole one talking here this whole time. So Darren, you got to talk too.
Yeah.
Let's talk about what we know about locations when it comes to kind of, you know, the beginning of a project.
Well, I want to say something about our if I can, DJ, about the this codifier idea and the perspectives that we all bring, different perspectives, and understanding what location is. It's really about what's relevant to us and to our work is in that moment. So it changes how we look at location. Obviously, location, there's XYZ, you know, time, there's like a location that we can all agree on, but what is it about that context that is useful to each of us? And I think that's where that codifier was important, to be able take that in, chew it up and go, okay, for you, this is what's relevant. And then seeing on the other side of that, or as a lens to understand where the issues might come out of that. So that, I think that's where the issue analysis comes from. But that idea that we put this codifier, this magical tool in place to understand those differences, I think was like you said, it's a sort of a, yep, we're just going to not talk about it too much, but I think it's actually an interesting idea to understand what people's perception of location is as we start to try and pull that from the process.
Yeah. And I think the big thing, right, is starting to understand in some of the current platforms that all of us kind of work in. Obviously, I'm on the Procore side of things. Locations are linear, basically in their kind of current status of the relationships. Things are basically defined by different levels or tiers. And within Procore, you can only tag one location to a particular object, which is definitely limiting in that aspect there. But what this codifier was just like our magic Rosetta Stone that would basically start taking this information together and start looking at locations in a whole different aspect, basically being kind of multifaceted or some sort of array. So people that are really smart, like Mr. Huddleston there, could probably write a relational database that can then start tying a lot of these points together. So if I pick level 2, I'm going to be able to grab a lot of that other information that may correspond to level 2, like northing and eastings, internal coordinates, elevation, levels, volume, like all that stuff that already kind of exists, but being able to actually kind of create those links so that as this thing kind of goes through the process, that it basically enriches that information. And so this is whoever's going to own this, whoever's going to create this, or Matt's probably already created one. It's going to basically kind of go through and help enrich some of those things. So basically, if the language that you're speaking is I'm doing site control and I'm doing layout, I don't really like level 2 doesn't help me. I need to know elevation. I need to know some northing and eastings or X, Y, Z coordinates of particular objects. By kind of as we talk through things, we realize some of that information is already there, but it isn't always presented like in essence of an RFI or drawings and some of those other things along those lines. Matt, you had some really good points on the whole locations, because you and I had some pretty good discussions around all of this.
Yeah, we spent good conversations. Well, I mean, where we come at it from our side anyway is the idea that cube is in the middle there, so that's kind of perfect, because that was the art I was going to try to draw. I didn't really prepare for today, so I apologize. But the idea is if you can identify, all the spatial boundaries of a building and then break it into smaller objects, if you will, that are like this cube, and that cube has the 6 different sides, and each of those different sides can represent a perspective of what that location means. So what you're talking about is, for some person, they care about level 2 zone A. So one side of that cube could be referred to as level 2 zone A. The other side could be system. This is the system breakdown structure. The other side could be a work breakdown structure. The other side could be a schedule line item, but they're all related to that same object. So different tools, different teams, different perspectives, or different needs about that cube are relevant to that cube, whatever that cube is. But from the perspective they're coming at it, they would define it differently. And so that's kind of how we tackle it with our stuff, is define the objects themselves first, and then define the properties from all the different perspectives and how they relate to that one instance of an object. And then you'll find the geometry of the object might change, but the concept stays the same. There's these things that exist in the structure that have different perspectives for different people, but it's always the same thing you're talking about. And then one of the things that Rachel was talking about when we were out there was you have like a concept of an issue where it could be an air handler unit. Say that object is an air handler unit. Well, that thing has its own location, but you're going to care about other objects like it that might have the same issue. So you have to pivot around, say, what is this thing I'm looking at? One set of properties for this thing, another set of properties for this thing is what it is itself, the type of object and other objects like it. And if you can go into it from that perspective, pivot, kind of like a Rubik's Cube, and then shoot out to the other side, you'll find it. But defining that object itself first gives you the framework and structure for capturing all these unique perspectives and roles. And so that's our approach to unifying, codifying location.
Yeah, Kelly, I'm going to pick on you a little bit because I know with your reality capture experience, survey, all that other stuff. When one of the ways that we were kind of thinking about this is right is, you know, Rachel's on the design team, right? So they pick a project site. Guess what you have there? Northing and eastings, right? Elevations, right? That's already defined. Then you start drawing the building footprint, right? You have an internal coordinate system, you have a shared coordinate system. So now you're further defining those values as you go through there. And then it gets a little bit more kind of granular in nature along those. But the problem is, as you probably know, it's still persistent, is if I want to look at things in Northing and Eastings, I'm really limited to Northing and Eastings. It doesn't really tell me where. Like if I just look at coordinate data, I'm like, I don't know where that is within the building. You know, that's where we're talking about this kind of codifier to actually kind of help translate this into what language do you need to speak? So we can translate it from English to Spanish, you know, French to German, whatever along those lines. But something is basic, like the Rosetta Stone is basically going to help kind of identify that.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of this curse of, you know, every project has multiple coordinate systems. But on top of that, every project has kind of unique, you know, whether it's wing 1, wing 2, or, you know, there's kind of basic ways that we, you know, voxelize. And so in some ways, Matt a little bit reminded me talking about voxelization. So like the way reality capture data is spatially indexed, right? It's all based on voxelization. You break everything up into little tiny 1 millimeter cubes, and then you decide if there's a point in that cube or not. And if it is, you have a point. And if there's 5 points in that cube, that's great. You don't have to store the data 5 times. You just say there's another point in this 1 millimeter cube, because nobody gives a crap if it's, you know, 0.1265 millimeters, you know, off from the other one, right? Or even if it is, you can record that only as a difference, right? So it's, you know, this is kind of these voxel trees, the way that you compress and you store and you share reality capture data. But inherently, it's basically a spatial index of where things are and where things aren't, right? You know, IFC, actually, part of the reason why an IFC GUID is calculable is because it is in and of itself a spatial index as part of the IFC GUID. We've got things like BCF, which codify, you know, how to share information like this, but they're highly limited right now because their kind of location tag capability is limited to just one coordinate system, which is great if everybody has the same coordinate system, but sucks if everybody has different coordinate systems, because then none of the issues show up in the right place. And then on top of this, we have the joy of 2D drawings, which particularly if they're printed to raster, they have a pixel coordinate system on the page. You can do that, but then you have to have a transform to figure out where that fits into the real world, you know. So any of the solutions out there that do hypermodeling, right? There's solutions to basically take your pixel-based coordinate system and then create a kind of frame within the project, a 2D slice where it has, you know, whatever plane it's on, and then it's offset. So, you know, we have, you know, if you think about all the different things that are out there, and I think part of the interest and challenge in this particular topic is, you know, if you include 2D drawings, every single project has hundreds of different coordinate systems that are in use on that project. And how do you actually, you know, make a location tag that then is translatable to all those hundreds of different things? You know, that's a real challenge. So I think, you know, codifier, I think is a great way to think about it. But in general, like, you know, I think one of the core infrastructures needed is kind of some kind of defined mechanism for managing and translating all these different coordinate systems on job sites in a way that's, you know, opaque to the end user, because if it was transparent, they'd be confused as fuck.
Yeah, that's why I love Kelly.
Well, but so to add to that, so that is the piece right there that correlation. What's his name over at anyway? Correlation, the concept. So the way that you're going to make this tie together and then be a Rosetta Stone, if you will, or pivot to be relevant to another perspective, is you need something to hook it to. You need to correlate the data to something. So you're always going to talk about correlation, like how do we know this RFI is connected to this inspection or relevant to this inspection, or how's it relevant to these two people? Well, if you don't have a key or something to correlate that data to, you don't have a way to connect the concept. And if you don't have a way to correlate different coordinate systems or different definitions of location, you don't have a way to connect it and then pivot it to other relevant parties. So you're never always talking about the same thing. You're just always siloed talking about different things. So the way you solve it, or the way I think it can be solved, is to have a central key that you can correlate that information to. Then you can apply all these different perspectives to a single key and then pivot around that key to connect that back out. And so that's sort of, it's what Kelly was just saying. You need to, absent the thing to connect it all to, you can't standardize language of location or workflows or records or, virtual reality or et cetera. And so that's where I would say you start there and then you can build on that, almost infinitely.
It's almost like a unifier as well, but let me, Nathan, thanks for.
I want to
having
jump
this
in.
step
I
back.
asked a question
Yeah.
before, or maybe Rachel or others that are further
Yeah.
upstream in the conversation can chime in on like, okay, yes, but like, how do you do that? It's a whole nother question that I think we should be having, right?
Yeah, it's so kind of what we talked about is after the design team is basically turning over, right, their information, whether it's early design packages, however it's going to be there, this codifier is basically a database that starts getting information kind of dumped into it. And so, if they're using Revit, all of this stuff has data that needs to be extracted. So you can extract coordinate information, out of the Revit files. You can extract coordinate information from the civil and the survey files along those lines, right? That's kind of your beginnings of the foundations. Then also start extracting, just even the list of drawings and some of those things there. And then the codifier, that's kind of how you get it to kind of set up. Now, what we don't know, and that's why we just kind of said, okay, we have this magic box over here, we're not even going to talk about, but something along those lines where it's going to be someone either needs to figure out how to create that relational database and then start connecting those points so that you can start beginning the mappings. And so as that information grows, that's what the codifier is going to do. The one thing it doesn't show here, Matt Huddleston loves PDFs. Absolutely loves PDFs. He wants to set them on fire and burn them all down, basically. But to Kelly's point before,
Hey, ISO standard, leave them alone. They're okay. They fit the bill.
It's fine, but PDFs are inherently dumb in nature, right? And that's what we say.
Pretty dumb format. PDF.
Less sophisticated. Okay? less sophisticated.
Sure, they haven't graduated yet and haven't kind of moved on from there. But I remember like looking at PDFs, like in Bluebeam in particular, when Bluebeam creates a PDF, their coordinate system starts at the top left of the sheet and then goes from there, which is really interesting to kind of look at. So part of the codifier was we would basically take those drawings that were being issued, run them through this codifier and basically enrich the drawings, because the workflow that we kind of showed is somebody basically picks a drawing and says, hey, I've got a wall that needs to move here. Once they pick within that drawing, we're basically now enriching that information. So now it's like, hey, it's on level 2, it's in area A, this is where it's located here, there's the XYZ coordinates, all that other stuff, because it's being able to kind of actually reference some of that information, because unfortunately PDFs are still used day in and day out with the industry, and there's no location enrichment that can be done. If a user drops a pin on the drawings and says, I have an RFI here, it comes down to levels, grids, it can even get more complex than that. But then that location is static unless it has some other sort of information within it as well. So being able to actually enrich those PDFs or those drawings so that when perfect state, all of us would love to be able to, hey, drop the pin on the drawing and it pulls all that data.
That to me is the answer to the question. Is the codification is establishing the rules of the governance of how it fits within grids, or how, or what is that degree translation from, coordinate, if you're going from real world into, your project coordinates. Like those are the things that have to be established and set in stone, and things that every BIM manager knows is kind of like the blocking and tackling, and then some, probably because there's more use cases that we're talking about, but it's like the basics of what you would do for that coordination, to the level of PDFs, to the level of some of these other opportunities. And I still think we're kind of skipping over like, oh yeah, that just happens. And I'm like, and then
well, we are, and obviously we didn't want to spend like a ton of time on it, but I mean, I think
well, and not what it should be, but like the
Correct.
mechanics of how we actually establish that meeting, like who establishes it, who pays for it. Like these are dollars that we have to justify, right? Like,
CPC will pay for it. We'll
Yeah.
go ahead and put you on the hook for it, Nathan.
for every single
Um,
project. Well, hopefully projects will pay CPC to help support it, but yeah, that's where I get stuck.
Yeah, I just feel like when talking with Rachel and kind of the others, we realize a lot of this information is already there. So a lot of this stuff doesn't actually need to be created. It just needs to be extracted and
The
then
rules for
connected.
codification need to be created, and that takes effort that we don't
Agreed.
put in. Right.
Well, I think,
Go ahead.
I think that, I talked about sort of just the practical, oh, well, we've got it from Revit, we've got it from all these different locations where you just dump it in and start extracting it from the project. Well, that's one project. And then you've got it, that's an exercise you're going to go through on one project, and you're going to come up with something that's going to work. And it's like, cool. But what about the next project and the next project? And it's like, what are the questions you have to ask each of the stakeholders to understand location, codification, that's consistent from I know where's Mark? Tell him to come in here. We're using his word.
His ears are definitely burning.
But that is something that the conversation, Nathan, that you bring up is like, how do we figure out what is going to be common so we can understand this consistently? Because you got projects that are 5, 6, 7 years long. Great, lots of information going into it. We can kind of invest the time and do that, and it's really cool for that 5, 6, 7 year project. But this is relevant to every project, and the ones that are 6 months or 6 years.
I mean, I think it is dependent on your side of the table. It's the BIM execution plan and how people approach BIM, and not every project will use BIM, but the ones that do can set the bar and then bring the industry forward. And so one of our arguments is always that, there's so much potential in BIM, and all the investment and effort and ROI is basically erased when you export it to a PDF. And when you export it to a PDF, you lose that data connection, you lose the codification concept here. And if we stop breaking the chain, keep it connected, if you follow a BIM execution plan that sets easy to follow, but well-defined process and structure for building a model that can then be translated, it's not translated, it basically exists. You're defining the objects, you're defining where they exist in 3D space, you're defining how they relate to other things. And that could just be 1 or 2 concepts of location tracking in the model, and others can be applied later, but you've created the structure to attach to and build from. And so in the model, you've created the objects. Those objects have boundaries and shapes and definition. What we do, not to promote, but what we do is we keep those objects alive. We take them to a living drawing, not a static PDF. The living drawing, those objects can maintain their permanence and properties. And through an intelligent drawing, you're able to interact with those objects in the same coordinate system and with the same transforms already pre-factored and calculated, and with all the properties connected. And so you're still interacting with an object-based technology where you can click on something and see all the other ways it can be communicated or translated. And so it does start with defining the objects. The path that we see is the easiest path to achieve this is nudging the industry to where it already is, trying to get BIM and concepts of like Revit and other tools adopted more, widely, but following certain practices that there's a measurable ROI for following them. And there is a measurable ROI because when everyone can go to a single object, click on it, and all these different stakeholders have real information in real time and can understand the impacts that they have on each other, you start to solve problems and become more efficient. And so you go to the source, which is the model, you build the model with simple rules, you keep that effort alive and you continue to enrich it as you move forward. And the breaking point again is PDF, unfortunately.
Well, real quick, you just defined the difference between a smart PDF and a dumb PDF. And we were talking about this on the prep call, was a model-based workflow. Even if somebody still wants to see a 2D PDF, if it's sourced from that same central BIM, I think that's the components. And the more, I mean, obviously that's probably partly some of your secret sauce, but to a certain point, like it's got to be an industry standard of like everybody does this reference point when you go from model.
We'll just have to.
What are you promoting? Yeah, to like that we should all be doing, because I think we can be on that page. Go ahead.
Yeah, we should just put a pin in this because we're gonna just go around in circles about execution plans, and Nicole's comment is great. How do I find it easy to follow? BIM execution plan. Everybody's got theirs that they think is the best. I actually think it comes
Well,
back down to just
follow diet plan, right? Like there isn't one. Like diets are
well, no,
hard.
there is. Hold on, there is. But anyways,
Yeah.
that's a whole other thing. But Kelly knows this, and I don't know who some of my other kind of Revit powers users are, but working with multiple coordinate systems, it has always been very difficult inside Revit to establish multiple coordinate systems, make sure they align. Which coordinate are you using? Are you using the project base point? Are you using the project survey point? Or is it the internal origin? Because Revit has 3, being able to kind of establish that, because that's really kind of what sets a lot of that stuff up. So, and I imagine Rachel see this in her career. I know Darren has seen it probably in his end for like getting models where you try to put models together. And I've even had design team models that were coordinated, and when you pull them in and align it, they're nowhere near each other. So that's part of it. That's just like I don't want to say it's a best practice. It's probably just one of those things you should know as part of your job, but it's not easy.
But it's solvable. It is a solvable concept. I mean, it's a common.
It is. But the current state of the industry, PDFs aren't going away. They're not going anywhere anytime soon. So it's still something that we're going to have to figure out how to work with. That's where kind of the secret sauce of the codifier.
And PDF as input versus PDF as output, because we've got some other slides down. Is like,
well, it's one of the two.
A lot easier than if it's the input, right?
That's what I was going to say on the BIM execution plan too. Is it if we define how the data that you create is going to be consumed, you kind of have some flexibility in the execution plan you want to follow. If you know the ROI that can be achieved by just doing certain things, whatever plan you follow is a choice. There could be multiple patterns to get a similar result. The idea is if you know you have to build objects in a certain way with certain definitions, but you have the flexibility to do a lot of other things your own preferred way. If we can give you the format to just follow so that you're gonna have this effect downstream if you hit these bare minimum checklist requirements. It's not so much a properly structured execution plan as guidelines for at least minimum requirements to create ROI downstream.
Sure, and that's great, but somebody still has to go through and validate everything is working kind of as it is. So, like when we talk about input sources, right? So, does everybody kind of at least understand the general thought process behind this location codifier? Anyone that was on the team there, if I'm missing kind of anything there, but the process basically is just to try to basically take all of this location information that we have and basically link it together. And then, so maybe this is where like trades would come in and any other that are on the call when it comes to trade partners. Locations are also WBS, work packaging, some of those other things as well, because you start thinking about HVAC systems, plumbing systems, structural steel, concrete, all that other stuff. That all has location data within it as well.
Yeah.
Right. And so one of the reasons why we chose the RFI is the example, and I can actually show you kind of what our example was here. I'm gonna go through the slides. Come on.
I spent so much time on that.
I know. I'm going to go back to it. This is what the perfect state would have been that we kind of figured out here was extracting the information from the design team models here, putting it into the location codifier, enriching those tags, and then part of the process would be is then basically taking all that information and applying it back into the PDFs, because PDFs are still what everybody uses at the end of the day. And the example that we specifically used was, I'm a framing contractor and this wall needs to move. The foreman in the field doesn't care about anything else. It's like, hey, drop a pin on the drawing. I have an RFI and it goes from there. What we talked about with that would potentially, the pain points that we kind of talked about is the RFI comes in, GC looks at the RFI, okay, level 2, here it is, here it's on A201. And then toss it over the fence to Rachel. Rachel goes, okay, we got to move the wall. So then you look at that one, and then Rachel, go. Yeah, you could better describe that. So once you get that, what happens?
Well, I mean, this is trying to artificial intelligence support for what we do is to be able to take something and go, okay, what other things is this going to impact? So that location is not just one. it is multiple things. And so we look at it and we start to evaluate what other either simultaneous concerns do we have, or follow on concerns as this wall moves. Do we have any systems that are going to be, what systems are going to be impacted by that, and having to chase that all down. So that is, it's not just about the one, which we all kind of understand. It's about what it's going to impact across the board.
And where this would benefit, right, with that codifier is when we have the understanding of like drawings themselves in nature, have location information as well, you could potentially get a list. So yeah, we send you A201, but part of that would be whether it's metadata within the RFI, it's called related information or potential impacts. You can also get another list of potential drawings that need to be reviewed by the team as well, because that's one of the things, Rachel, you shared was like, then people have to take the time to actually go look at what other drawings need to be updated. And no offense to your design professionals, but sometimes you just send back that one drawing without updating the other sheets.
Let's all be honest though, like this is, and this is where Matt, I'm on your train here. It's like we're taking something, right? We're taking something that's data rich, dumping it out to something that is data less, and then trying to act as if it has a bunch of data and respond to it. So it's just that is where we're stumbling in terms of understanding the impact.
Let me push back on that.
Yeah,
because I actually think people are unnecessarily hating on PDF. So let me make on 2D drawings, like printed drawings in general. So let me put it this way, right? The data that exists in a 2D drawing doesn't exist in the paper, it exists in your head, right? It's our ability to interpret the paper, right? That's where the data is created on the fly by people with experience looking at it, right? That's how the relationships work. It's not that they're data poor, it's that they don't themselves contain the data. The data is there, it just has to be extracted by, right now, somebody like you
and translated. Right. It has to be translated into their language.
Exactly. And sure, people have been talking about ChatGPT and AI and blah, blah, blah. But here's the thing, right? Like, think about how graphics engines think about how BIM actually works on your computer. I guarantee you the stuff you see on the screen is data poor and stupid, right? It's basically a mesh that's being used by the graphics card to display the BIM on the screen. And then there's a lovely layer that exists there inside the software in which when you mouse over it, it does a coordinate system transform to figure out where the underlying data model actually is so that you can then select the object and see all the data that's associated with that object in the BIM. None of that's on the screen.
All the stuff that doesn't matter up into the point where it does matter, right?
But what I'm saying is, it's if you think about it at a very high level, it's actually no different, right? The graphics card and your screen are unaware of the data. The interpretation is happening because there's something communicating, connecting the actual database and the data model and all the information that's on the back end to the coordinates and 2D on the screen that your mouse is. Which is the exact damn thing we wish we could do with a 2D drawing like a PDF that's in raster format. So what I'm saying is, I don't think PDFs are unusable in this framework. What they need is this exact thing that we're talking about so that somebody can mouse over the flipping PDF and get data rich because there's some underlying coordinate. So that pixel on the frickin' 2D raster has an actual coordinate value in 3D that's associated to the data model, because that's exactly how BIM gets drawn in your screen in Revit. Exactly. There's no freaking difference.
And when you pick that pixel, and based with the codifier, right, that relational database, it now has so much more information associated with it. That's what we're trying to solve.
Yeah, I can tell you all the data for that object that's in the database as long as that pixel has a coordinate value. And so that's why I think this is so important, because this framework, if we can actually figure out how to make it work, this framework basically gives us the ability to make PDFs intelligent, as opposed to saying it's a pretty dumb format. It can become a pretty dope format.
Nice, Kelly.
Wow.
I like it. That's really good.
Point very well taken, Kelly. I think that is true about all this, is that there is something, if it's my brain, your brain, if it's the computer making that leap, yeah, it's clearly not all on the screen. It's not all on the paper. It's not all on the form, but it is that codification that we can layer in that can help us do that translation or allow us to see the depth of information that is there based on that location or based on
And
whatever
it's,
it is that we're looking at.
and to kind of move this along as well, it's like,
Actually,
okay,
go
so
back one slide and then we'll keep going. Because there's some nuance in that first graphic we spent the longest time on. I think it's the one, yeah, right here. So that's why the document itself, the call it the base point, is what the team would have to establish as those early translation points of this is my, off 000 and blah, blah, blah. This PLC, the actual codifier, is the rules and the governance of like how that would actually be implemented, like what would be checked at the point of entry. And if it doesn't have it, it's going to kick it back, or how is it going to put things into it so that when you pull it out later, that it's going to have those things in it. And so it's two parts, right? And we have to really separate those two of what is the translation, and then what are the rules of how we're going to enforce the compliance to said translation.
yeah, but part of it is just trying to make it that much easier at the end of the day, because the reason why kind of this discussion comes in place is, again, that's why we took the example of the RFI. Is just the RFI gets thrown over the fence and it's just got one sheet and there's a little pin that says, hey, there's an issue here. The design team has to decipher this. They have to take the time to review to see what other potential sheets. But if you had the codifier in place, they could get a list of, hey, here are the drawings and here are the potential systems impacted by this here. Now, what we did talk about as well is, and this is something that has to be defined within that, is what is the zone of influence? Because you can't just pick like a single pixel on the screen. It's got to have some sort of boundary box so that you can then identify some of the other potential impacts with that. But on the design team workflow, it's here's the sheets, look at these sheets may need to be updated by a team so that when it comes back. And so when the RFI gets back, right, comes back from the design team, goes to the GC, what does the GC typically do? Email everybody or only email a few and said, here's an RFI, you have 5 days to review and respond to see if it has an impact on you. And then you get 30, 40, 50 of those emails a day. People, it just becomes noise. No one ever really looks at that. And so then that's when we've all been there. Then that one RFI now leads to 10 more RFIs because people didn't get the chance to kind of look at that. So we're also talking about like when it comes back and gets distributed, part of that information that can be kind of shared is, okay, here's the drawings, here's the systems. If the project has gotten to a point where you've got trades actually modeling their systems, pieces, all that other stuff in place, that has coordinate information with it. That has a WBS, that has work packaging associated with it. That's where you can do that. And then what we talked about is almost creating like a magnitude of the impact. So when that RFI went out and it was affecting framing, ceilings, piping in that wall, conduits that are within that wall, some of those other things, the RFI would kind of go, hey, these are the things that we have seen that probably have the most impact with this particular RFI. That way you kind of help filter that noise and kind of streamline it. So if I'm the electrician on the project and I see this RFI coming in and it says, hey, you might want to look at this because we've figured that this has some sort of impact with your system, they can actually have the opportunity to review that and look at it and make those changes. Instead, it just becomes noise. And we've all been there. RFI changes when the framer lays it out, right? The sleeve's in the wrong spot. And then once it goes through like BIM coordination with like Darren's team, they draw it up and they're like, well, the piping's not in the wall. We're going to leave it in the wall until the design team tells us to move the piping within the wall. And there's another RFI, there's another RFI, there's another RFI. So that's kind of what this whole thing with the codification, right? And kind of this linking with all of that as well. And then that ties back into the reporting aspect of it. And this is what Matt had really talked about too, is RFIs have enriched location data, photos, issues, anything along those lines. Now you can actually start seeing if you pick on a particular wall, that wall has its own spatial coordinates, right? X, Y, Z. Hey, here are the RFIs associated with this. here are the changes, here were the issues associated with the wall, because in essence, we're basically using that location to show us the history that has happened, not with the wall, but within that defined space that we want to look at.
The boundaries.
Yeah,
Yeah, so building on Kelly and then building on these examples, what Kelly was saying, so you have that pixel, the pixel becomes an object. The object is now something like a wall, but it's much bigger than just a pixel, but it also contains objects within it potentially. So you have the bounding box of that shape, and then you have relations of parent-child, like what exists within that bounding box of that shape. So the shape itself is the wall. The wall has the boundary. Another object has similar pixels, coordinate system inside of that. So you can see what's impacted. And then where the PDF doesn't, does or doesn't break down, however you want to talk about it, but PDFs come from different perspectives too. So overhead looking down, plan view, that kind of makes sense. You can have a consistent coordinate system or transforms. When we start going elevation sections and multiple viewports per sheet, it starts to break down. And so what you need to do is not do a translation on coordinates. Again, go back to objects. If you can identify the object specifically that's represented on that sheet, you can attach all the information to it. And so that's our approach anyway. And it tends to work. There might be other ways too, but if you can click the object, regardless of perspective, regardless of its placement, regardless of viewports and sheets and everything else, no matter what, that object can exist 10 times on the same drawing or 1 time on a drawing.
you can also find similar relationships to where that may occur.
Yes.
So if this change happens on level 2, is it going to happen on level 3, level 4, level 5?
Well, the
other
object
locations in
the
there?
object tells
So-
you everything. The object will tell
Correct.
you what other sheets it's on. So you immediately know other sheets impacted, tells you the boundaries of its own contents. So what else could be impacted? And then it also tells you where the things like it are. So the things, so when you talk about reporting now, okay, we have an RFI, we know there's going to be a change. It's going to change this wall. This wall is moving. It's going to have an impact on these other object types, which could have impacts on other people. Where else do those objects show up and should they be changing too? You can now generate an automatic report. And this is, again, it's only using what BIM has created, but it's using it through a drawing so the whole project can access it. And when the whole project can access it, it actually becomes useful. And then when people can update and interact with a drawing, which is a perspective people do understand, the drawings themselves aren't being knocked. It's just the technology or the limitations of certain technology and how you interact with those drawings is what we're knocking. And what you can do with an object-oriented drawing is interact with the object itself, not the static picture, but the object, and then pivot around it depending on purpose. So that same object can report a status, that same object can intake data, and that same object becomes your focal point of, well, everything relevant to it. So whether it's schedule, inspection, RFI, installation, checklist, you name it, cost, it gets associated to the object that's represented. And
Well,
so
whatever the issue is, or the thing you're trying to pin now has some sort of it's object-based or coordinate-based in essence, instead of just being kind of a flat pin on a
the
drawing.
coordinate is a subset to the object. The
Correct.
coordinate system is a subset to the object. Define the object first, and then all these other things are defining attributes of the object. So this is how you can address multiple location concepts. XYZ is a subset of an object, work breakdown structure, subset of that object. And so these are defining characteristics of the object, and therefore they can all be attached, and then they can all be translated out to the relevant stakeholders.
Yeah, and the big thing anybody else talked about as well is even with locations, think about building systems, supply air, return air, exhaust, whatever the systems have, piping systems, plumbing systems, all of those other things are where, right? That's location information as well. So that's why, it's also critical for the trades to also be kind of included in some of this stuff, because then that helps them. Instead of, again, if I've just given a PDF and said, hey, Benny, this wall moved, take a look at it. And you're like, okay, what do I need to look at? Is it just impacting what's in the wall? Is it impacting what's outside of the wall? Is it, what else? What else is it going to be potentially impact? That's where that kind of location enrichment comes into play. It's like, hey, here's the systems in your scope. This RFI is potentially affecting some of those systems within your scope.
That's what forced us to get that far and start going into the drawings themselves. We used to do a different mapping concept for tracking locations, and where they stopped being useful was to the MEP trades, the systems, because they said, we don't care about floor plans, walls and rooms and levels and zones. We care about systems and where they run and how they run and what they impact. And so we realized we needed to go a level deeper. And so in going a level deeper, do we create it ourselves, or can we leverage something that exists? And something that did exist, not as often as you like though, is the BIM model. So the data is there to be leveraged. You just have to leverage it if you can, or when it's available. And so it's in a drawing. That drawing comes from an authoring tool. All the drawings come from an authoring tool. How sophisticated the authoring tool is varies, but if you can nudge people to the more sophisticated tools, it unlocks a bunch of potential. But when you get the data from the authoring tool, you can then enrich that data and keep it enriched through the drawing. And so the systems were specifically what forced us to shift into representing the stuff into the drawings, because that's the perspective that user needed, because they needed to track productivity on the object, inspections on that object, the performance, commissioning performance test on the object, like segment by segment, click by click, connection by connection. They needed to track it all. And so when you give them that interactive experience through the drawing, they can do it. And so that forces you, but then again, it's a different, your old breakdown structure of building, level, zone, room doesn't address that new thing, that new object called a system. And so they need their own concept. And so you start building these conflicting location-based trackers, and they're all different, even though they mean the same. And we realize, okay, let's build the objects first, attach these concepts to the objects, and then it starts to work. And so it was the MVP trades that forced us into making the drawings themselves, interactive.
Do we feel that we have the definition of what the different data fields or what we should be putting out from the authoring tool? Because a lot of
I guess that's where we could definitely, go kick the horse against more on a BIM execution plan, or as Kelly suggested, we can just go to Chat GPT and have it generate an execution plan. I will bring up Mark Decker. He was very proud of his 4-page BIM execution plan that seemed to be pretty solid. We've all got our different iterations there, but I mean, honestly, if I don't want to put everything in one basket, but Revit has a lot of that stuff that's kind of within there. And Revit has the ability to kind of align and kind of, leverage shared coordinate systems and things along those lines. That's where I feel like if they're aligning in some aspect, there you have at least some sort of one of those coordinate systems is going to match, right? And then you have the fun part as well, as then who, if you all have ever done site layout or do some other things, you probably don't want to key in northing and eastings. That's where they typically create a project coordinate system, start at 1,000 and then kind of go from there. So they're not keying in, especially when it's a 12-digit coordinate and you fat finger one of those, you might be you might be across the street when you're not supposed to. So I feel like that's kind of established, Benny, but the problem is still current state of the industry. Not all of the trades are in Revit. They're still using fabrication, right, on the CAD side of things. Quick pin, I've still seen some of that out there. Basic CAD, AutoCAD MVP, so some of those other things. So I feel like the data is there. This is what this codifier is going to do, is just to kind of help kind of merge some of those things. Because if you ask some BIM professionals, if you will, hey, can you go ahead and bring in our model, acquire that coordinate system, set up that coordinate system, and then when you export those things out, make sure you're using the right coordinate system. And most people are like, what? I have no idea. Why don't we just use project internal? And you're like, that's why a lot of BIM projects are used project internal, because they don't want to use shared coordinates.
You can use the facility, just define the facility itself and give it an address, and the address starts to make it really unique. And
that's already defined by the design team at the beginning of the project.
Then there's ways to get them to conform to that. Well, I would assume,
Yeah.
In a perfect world.
Yeah.
But the other thing we're trying to solve too, I think, is why do we need location? So what is the reason for location? And the reason is usually just to get people to where they need to be faster to do what they need to do. And so in one type of terminology doesn't get everyone where they need to get quickly. And so you create that RFI. That RFI has a list of objects or locations or marked up maps attached, and that kind of gets them. There's a few ways to do this. So if you can identify the things that need the tasks that need to be addressed, whatever they are, we're calling them issues, RFIs. It could be work scheduled to be done. That's not an issue that's being resolved. Anything that needs to be done has a place where you need to go to get it done. And when you can associate the objects to that task, you can jump to the views or perspectives of that, in real time with a smart drawing. With a smart drawing, you can say, okay, I have a schedule that says I need to install these pipes on this date and time. Where do I go to do that? Well, an intelligent drawing can jump you to those pipes in every drawing that those pipes are represented on, and back to a 3D perspective if you wanted to see it. And now you know where to go and what to do and where it relates to other things in that structure, rooms or walls or whatever. And so one of the reasons we're trying to solve this is to get people to be more efficient and more valuable more quickly, remove the non-value adding steps. And so by associating objects to tasks and associating objects to views and perspectives, you're able to jump people to what they actually care about and need more quickly, so they can just go do what they need to do. So the intent of the codification is to make people more efficient and better at communicating and connecting disconnected data. That allows you then to go do things, be more productive, more efficient, better data, better lessons learned, better all that kind of stuff. And so when you click a drawing, you click an object in a drawing, and that gets attached to the RFI, that RFI now knows where that origination point was, the author sheet, the origination point, objects around it, and other sheets where it's represented. So it becomes like a really rich set of data. And then the trades can say, okay, I got to go fix this thing, or the design team can say, okay, we got to see what else is impacted by this thing. But all that data is already collected and gathered. So now you're just doing what you do best, depending on who you are.
We're just trying to relate them across, right? And so I wanted to Chris put a really good point within the chat here. Kelly, I think you might appreciate this because I know you're almost as old as I am. But when I think about, like, if I look at an RFI, the Starship Troopers, would you like to know more? Yeah, I'd like to know more. Let me look at this. Okay, right. I feel like there's a common, there is a common language when it comes to construction. You know, when you're at that job site, level 2, level 3, right? There's a common language, even with drawings. If I said, hey, Matt, go look at A201, you're going to know what to kind of look for there. But Chris, your point is really good. I think we have the concept down, but like with anything else, it's going to be managed. There's going to have to be kind of some rules kind of put in place. And then where at the different points in time is this data collected and then kind of added to the process? Because our kind of thoughts as the team here is there is already so much like good relevant information that gets passed down from the design team, and then it gets changed and none of it kind of stays together. And so like when other teams were looking at our stuff, they were like, well, I don't care about the drawing. I want to know about my pour sequence. Well, guess what? If you define that pour sequence in the codifier, that information gets linked across. You got work breakdown structure, you got work packaging, all of this stuff kind of starts being relatable. So, but it was basically just to kind of help translate things when, depending on how you wanted to see the location specific information, you could system coordinates, site coordinates, you know, all of some of those other ones. But I do feel like, yeah, how are you going to capture the data? I won't even let Kelly talk about this one, but now start defining the process of how you're defining data, how accurate you are. You know, if you're using laser scans to start that out, right? That's a whole other thing. Then it's the management of that data, you know, because a lot of people just want to be like, hey, I'm just going to put it in there, just going to spit this magic thing out. And as soon as it fails once, everyone's like, well, that sucks. I'm never using that again. I'm just going to go back to the old way of doing things. And then that usage, right? Trying to see if it's going to be used in part of like typical process, right? We review it, make sure it's working. I feel like there's a lot of benefit there because there's the opportunity to try to inform people in a better way about issues, changes, some of those other things. So that because at the end of the day, I think we all understand this, locations is really what can tie everything together at the end of the day, however you want to look at it.
Yeah, and just to throw a bit of color or some of my background, I'm in relative terms, I'm still a relatively new interloper to construction, but have been in analytics for 2 decades. And I was curious to connect with Mark here. Back in 2011, I had a company that was acquired by Esri. And what we were doing at that point was we built a bridging technology that went from traditional business intelligence, tabular analytics, to spatial, sort of as bidirectional, bringing 2 worlds together. And so the parallels here are it's the same thing, right? And the comments around BIM's great design tool, like it's a source of that data. The management of the best tools for management of spatial data, they're prevalent across industries. They're just not used within industries. And back in 2019, we did a little, it was a little pilot on our side, but we took data out of, I believe it was out of AutoBid. And, so on-screen takeoff, we pulled that data out and dumped it into a geodatabase and recreated that piping model. And so, and all of a sudden that became interesting because you had all sorts of ability to apply spatial analytics to a rough and ready model, right? So, what would be my bill of material inside of this lasso area? And so, you need different levels of precision at different points in time.
Correct.
But sometimes the pin on the PDF is good for go here. This is where the bad shit is. And so that's yeah.
I like Kelly's point. He's still cleaning his keyboard, I think, or something. It is like it's the PDF. It's still going to be, the term is not right. The lowest, I guess it's going to be the lowest point of entry. Everybody's pretty much used to working with some sort of PDFs wherever they come from. But just being able to kind of leverage this and kind of go from there. But all of this, right? So we kind of got to get through a couple of things here. When we kind of talk about this other stuff, so these are some of the graphics. We talk about just kind of this RFI process here, right? As part of some of those standards. He's showing the Procore side of things. There is a location. You can tag it to sheets, some of those other things, but it's basically a single location. There's no I can't attach multiple things or think about it in different things unless I take the time to actually type it out, which no one really has that time to begin with. And then this is kind of showing that new format connector so that when it gets kind of, when the RFI is there, it kind of gets put over there. They may not have those locations in there, or it could just be as simple as level 2. Being able to kind of use that codifier to enrich it. So when the RFI goes over to the format as it, maybe that's one of the thoughts we had is once it kind of goes to the format, it already has some of that pertinent information that the design team would then need when it comes back. It's got some of that additional information so that people can kind of leverage it at the end of the day here, right? So that location tag, I feel like we should find another word for location. There's an opportunity there for the location or something along those, because then you talked about Esri. I didn't even talk about all the whole GIS aspect of things and being able to kind of leverage that a little bit better here. But kind of this slightly ties into the RFI or just some of the communication that happens is just being able to let everybody know here's a change or an issue. It's associated with this location, systems, levels, drawings, everything along those lines, so that it helps people be able to kind of decipher and digest that there. So then you can figure out if you have to make a change or not, or if you have to, go through a pricing exercise along those things there. We already did a lot of debate questions here. Yeah, so obviously part of that is minimum data. So we kind of talked about some of that stuff, but a lot of that is already, I think we'd be in agreement. Obviously each design team is different. I think HDR might be a little bit more solid than the others, but we're just saying that because Rachel's on the call. But at least there's coordinate data there within the model, right? It's got site coordinates and things. Yeah, who is going to best be the one to actually enforce that validation and codification? That's a great question. And then, yeah, so then we talk about the BCF. This is one that I'm not sure if we have time to kind of dig into. Might be one that we do a kind of on a follow-up topic as well. But if the BCF is the standard, it's definitely lacking, right? Definitely has the potential to have more of that information because then the BCF kind of really helps translate across multiple authoring platforms and systems, regardless of what you're in. You would be able to then kind of see that if it's model-based, CAD-based, some of those other things along those lines. So, but Matt, I'm going to say your point because I see you coming off mute, but one of those big things is eventually what where it gets to is instead of just drawing a point, things become associated with objects. So that RFI we talked about for the wall, instead of it just being a point on the PDF, its future, perfect state is the wall itself. has that RFI attached to it. I know your platform does that already. Some other ones kind of do something along those lines, but that's actually where you can then further leverage the information that's there inside the BIM model. Kelly, you just got to say this stuff.
I
That's a
didn't
good
want
one.
to interrupt you, and I literally have to go pick up my kids from school. So, peace.
No, it's good. I definitely appreciate your perspective on things. Thank you, Kelly. Because it's a good kind of point there, but it's not just and then what data inputs remain consistent. I feel like typically there's some sort of location aspect in any sort of issue. RFI, inspection, observation, clash, right? If you're running coordination, there's some sort of coordinate, XYZ information, or maybe just the XY that's there. So I feel like that's consistency. That's where the codifier kind of comes into play.
Yeah, it could be paint color. Paint color is a property on a wall or a door, and it could be hundreds of walls or doors. And so there is a location associated to a question like, what color should this be?
Yeah, would you want to know which all walls were supposed to be painted a specific color?
Or if you make a change, what does that change apply to, vice versa? So like there's then the drawing is like the lowest common denominator. Everyone understands and can interpret the drawing. The question or the problem, I don't think we have time for today, but the one that I would present is to design team or design build groups is what incentives are needed to keep models current throughout the process so that we don't deliver a model and stop maintaining a model. And how much time do we need to save the design team so that they can offset that time to keep the model current when these changes have to be applied? Like that's the real, I think, piece to try to solve, because the rest of this feels like it falls in place. And to the points in the chat, like I think BIM is the starting point. It doesn't capture everything, but it lays the foundation and the data structure to then build upon and keep moving forward. But keeping at least that part current and consistent. Another debatable term, digital twin, gets you closer to accurate digital twin, accurate as-built, and more valuable data post-construction. And so how do we, unify the whole process and keep it going? And anyway, that would be maybe another thing.
Yeah, I think it's some kind of good things there. But this is what I definitely think. This is, I think, probably would be the hardest thing to figure out, is the WBS and the work packaging and aligning that with, in the codifier in some aspects, because typically design teams aren't creating the work breakdown structure. That's typically the GC. Work packaging is more on the trades side of things, right? To leverage fabrication, a lot of that things along those lines, and being able to kind of again align these together. Because it's not all going to just be input at once. It is something that's going to have to grow and maintain. And I think that's one of the bigger things, is who's going to maintain this? How do you update the system? How do you validate the system? How do you, let it know what those changes are? I will say this, because Rachel actually said it in public and people heard, is that sometimes it may not be her per se, but sometimes when the RFI, when an RFI happens, they may just be pencil whipping it in Bluebeam and not actually updating the model.
I observed that in the industry, yes.
Yeah, I think we all have.
Yep.
Or back in the day when they actually just changed the text of the dimension in Revit and not actually change it.
Oh,
Yeah, so the fun things there. Anyone else? I feel like I've been doing a lot of talking. Darren hasn't said anything at all. The rooster.
Hey, good afternoon.
There it is. You said it.
Yeah. No, you're right on point. I think I've got some notes from our last meeting, and yeah, you've covered all the bases. It's been a good discussion.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
I'm going to chime in a bit.
Please.
So I'm going to push back and say you can't expect technology to solve bad practice all the time.
Agreed.
Right? I mean, this is the thing that's bothered me the most about some of these discussions. It's like, well, this is just how we do things. It's just how we do things, even though it's not best practice, even though we know it is the least productive way of doing things. So we say, well, let's go make a technology to fit our best practices so we still get good results. And believe me, this discussion happens at the global level, not just here. But the more interesting discussions I have at the global level are they're willing to change their best practices so that they are best practices. And that when they talk about executing and using a model BIM in a BIM-based project delivery, that's what they do. They agree to do that. And so they limit the use of 2D or, point of use. And that's where this stuff starts to make sense. So part of my issue or idea is maybe we need to stop talking about the technology solving everything, and we need to do the harder thing, which is also the higher ROI, which is changing the practice.
100% agree with you there. I'll help you push. Not pushing back from there, but you're absolutely right. Technology can't fix horrible work methods, or I don't like best practices, like best methods. Technology can't necessarily fix that, right? That's the discipline. So you nailed it there, Jeffrey, and you got it all done within like the last couple of seconds before we get kicked out of here. So thank you everyone for participating and doing that. Jeffrey, nice